on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be covering a little bit of information regarding fantasy drafts within franchise mode in MLB The Show 24, because I've just kind of was toying around with the idea of doing a fantasy draft and wanted to give you guys some information if you ever considered doing one yourself. The first bit of information that I want to give to you guys is the number of rounds that you actually have to go through. Now, you don't have to draft every single round of the draft. You can select to sim at any point during the draft, but you might end up with a lower end farm system, a lower end team, just depends on where you decide to sim. But I wanted you guys to know that you have to go through 90 rounds in order to complete a fantasy draft in this game. And if you're actually looking to fill out an entire roster and build a decent team, you're going to have to spend a couple of hours by yourself doing this fantasy draft. It took me quite a bit of time in order to do this. Don't back out in the middle of a fantasy draft, because that could create problems for you where it's not going to save. So make sure that if you are going to do a fantasy draft, you have enough time to complete it. So you have to go through 90 rounds, which can be quite tedious. The other bit of information that I wanted to give you here just on the base roster screen is that there is a couple of different ways that you can go about doing a fantasy draft, and I actually like the team that I got quite a bit. You can go through it getting a high development team, a young team, or you can go with a high overall older team, and both methodologies can be very successful. So with the Rockies here, I was able to get a lot of A and B potential players that are either really good now or on the verge and are going to be good for me, you know, high 60s, low 70s types of guys. So I have a full team pretty much where I have an A potential at every position except for maybe some of my bullpen positions. And I'm definitely really excited about the prospects of what I can do with this franchise mode, but you don't necessarily have to play it that way. You can do even a mix of both. If I go ahead and take a look at the Dodgers, for example, the Dodgers have a kind of high overall team, some higher aged players, not necessarily those A development players to build around quite as much, a lot more C's and B's and those types of things, but they spent their draft picks on more veteran, higher overall seasoned players like Wheeler and Turner and Bregman and Real Muto and Bogarts, you know, those types of guys. And so they're going to have a better roster now, but in the long run, they're going to age out quite a bit quicker. Depending on what you're trying to do with your franchise mode, you might want to go one way or the other. And I'm not trying to discourage anybody from doing a fantasy draft, because again, with a team like the Rockies, this can be a fantastic way to do a rebuild with a team. But one of the biggest issues with fantasy drafts in this game is that it's not like a fantasy draft in other titles where you end up with contracts allocated to those players based on where they're picked. Because I went into my budget screen here and I was a little bit confused as to why Starling Marte, who I drafted in like the, I don't know, 60th, 70th, 80th round, was earning 19.5 million. Well, I went through the process of looking up these players' actual contracts, and these are those players' actual contracts. So if you know a good bit about contracts, you could potentially draft based on contracts alone and figure out, you know, who's going to have the most control for you and those types of things. So Michael Harris was actually a pretty solid pickup for me because he's only making 9 mil and I have control over that player. But I'm paying Starling Marte 19.5 and Charlie Blackmon 13, who both might not even be on my MLB roster, because I guess the system is just not advanced enough and not designed to give players contracts in a fantasy draft like other titles would. So keep that in mind, that you're, depending on how you draft, going to have to re-sign a lot of your team, or you're going to have to manage a couple of potentially bad contracts. I just think that it's really helpful to know ahead of time that if you are going to do something like a fantasy draft, that this is what the contract situation looks like, because this means I'm going to have to do a lot of legwork in order to get our contract situation correct and in order to make sure that my team actually stays together. Another thing that is nice about fantasy drafts, though, is that it's not like a fantasy draft in Madden, for example, where once the fantasy draft is set, nobody's going to want to trade because they got the players at the positions that they wanted to get. This, that, the other thing, various factors make it so that teams don't want to trade. That is not the case within fantasy draft in MLB The Show 24. you're able to go out here and just execute on whatever trade you want. I mean, they're going to value it the same way that they would in, you know, a typical franchise mode. It doesn't really make a difference. I've already gone through and traded a couple of prospects, because when you get to the end of the draft here, you're going to have to draft quite a few D potential, C potential guys. So I'm going to try to consolidate them. I also don't need 90 players on my entire roster. So I'm going to consolidate some of these prospects into maybe just lower overall C potential guys. And then the final bit of information that I have for you guys that'll be really important for you in a fantasy draft is kind of understanding where players get drafted. You're going to see, of course, all of the 90 plus overall and, you know, close to 90 overall players that have a potential getting drafted early on, especially the guys like Michael Harris, who are 23 years old and 88 overall A potential. But just because you get a 10th overall pick or something like that does not mean you're not going to get one of the top players in the game. The CPU is not perfect at drafting within this game like it is in other games. It is pretty good at going out and finding the high potential guys, but it, in my opinion, is not perfect at drafting. It might select a 30-year-old 90 overall A potential player over Michael Harris, who's 2388A, which is a huge mistake potentially by the AI. So I just wanted to show you a quick example of this. Looking at this draft here, just popping into one real quick. The CPU is making, in my opinion, what I would consider some mistakes in drafting. Now, Ronald Acuna going first overall, that makes sense. He's 26. If I move my camera, you can see he's a 99. Corey Seager, 29.98, 29.98, 99 for Shohei Ohtani. And then I selected Spencer Strider, 25.97. Julio Rodriguez, 23.93. I was considering going with him as well. This is where things are interesting. It's going to kind of prioritize overall in certain situations. If I were to take a look at this draft order, I would say that Perez here should be, based on the fact that he has a potential as well, this guy should be a top 5 pick, being that he is 20 years old and an 89 overall with a potential. He should be above some of these guys that are maybe a 99 or a 93. I mean, this guy might be a better draft pick than Rodriguez. He might even be a better draft pick than Strider, Ohtani, Seager, depending on what you're looking at in franchise mode. But you'll see those things continue to happen as you go down the list. So you can see Mike Trout, as an example, slides all the way to pick 13, which is maybe a little bit more reasonable for a 32-year-old 99 overall player like Aaron Judge and Mookie Betts, who are a pick 6 and pick 7. I think more so in this early teens range would be more appropriate for players like that. So the point that I'm getting at here is that the CPU does interesting things in the draft, and I'm not necessarily saying that these are wrong. I mean, who's to say you shouldn't just pick up a 99 overall player that's in their young 30s or, you know, late 20s, because they are going to be around for quite a while. But you're going to get some really good players at, you know, various points in the draft. You could end up with pick 30 and you're still getting an A potential relatively young player. You can end up with a pick in the 20s, so on and so forth. And I just wanted to make that clear because it's a little bit different than fantasy drafting in other games where, you know, you're going to see all of the top players go off the board early that are young. You're going to see the young quarterbacks especially go off the board early. That's not the case here. Now, I will say that certain positions are prioritized at certain points. So what's going to happen here in the first round or two is you're going to see mostly the high overall and young players with high dev going off the board. And you're going to start to see some players like a Royce Lewis, who is only 24.84, go off the board because they have a certain dev. Even a Francisco Alvarez, for example. And that is going to open up the door for you to prioritize certain positions. Once those players start to go off the board, you're going to start to see certain positions prioritized by the CPU versus what you want to prioritize. Catcher is going to be prioritized pretty early on. You can see here that we're in the second round, and some of the best catchers have gone off the board, especially like the high development A potential catchers, because this is a position that is very hard to find within the MLB. There are very few actual good catchers, especially catchers that can contribute well at the plate. And so if you want to get a catcher, you should probably consider addressing the position within the first couple of rounds, or you're going to be waiting like I did to get a catcher that maybe has, a potential as a 70 overall, and you're kind of risking it. Do I wait to get this guy until round 5 or something like that? Or do I try to take him early just to ensure that I have a hard position locked up? That's the trade-off. Another thing to consider positionally, what the CPU is going to prioritize is starting pitchers. Honestly, I would recommend that you really don't draft relief pitchers or closing pitchers. I mean, they do have some value, and obviously you can get a really good guy, but some of the top ones are off the board already early into the rounds, and that's kind of a mistake that the CPU is going to make, where you could take a guy like Brian Abreu, which is what I did in round 3, 4, or 5, or even later if he's still there, and move him to closing pitcher as a 26 with B87. That's a fantastic draft pick, and you're going to be able to get away with something like that. Now, what I did was I focused heavily on starting pitchers and just moved some over to relief pitcher, because the depth here is really bad at relief pitcher. You can still be grabbing A potential starting pitchers while they're grabbing C potential 30-year-old 78 overall pitchers in the relief category. What they will do is they will start to kind of run on these positions at certain points within the draft. You'll see a lot of the pitchers go off the board, then they'll start going to other positions, then at some point they'll come back to the starting pitching position. So what I would recommend is that you guys get at least one ace player, one player that's meant to be your ace within the first couple of rounds, the first 2 rounds probably, and get your building block player within the first 2 rounds. So like I said, I went for, a center fielder. In this draft, I went with starting pitcher first, so now I would be looking for specifically a position player to fill out my roster and build around. So I would again be looking for somebody in general that is, relatively young with a high development ceiling. Find a starting pitcher to build around, find a position player to build around, and then after that, you're going to want to prioritize filling out your pitching rotation and defensive positions. So what I did and what I like to do, because I think it's the best way that you can acquire the most high development players, is go starting pitcher and building block within the first 2 rounds, flip-flop whichever order you want to do it in, and then I'm going to fill out a lot of my positions. So I'm going to make sure that I get a catcher. Specifically, I wanted to make sure that I got a good center fielder because of the athleticism that I require at that position that's rare to find, and I wanted to make sure that I got a good shortstop, third baseman. Shortstop is a good position because Ellie De La Cruz is out here, O'Neill Cruz is out here. These guys both have really high ceilings, really good athleticism, those types of things, and there's a whole bunch of other A potential guys that are stacked at the shortstop position, so this is a pretty deep position. What I did actually was I drafted my center fielder, and then I drafted 2 shortstops. I got Ellie De La Cruz and then Volpe or Marte or somebody else down here that had A potential, and then I'm just going to move that guy to third base or second base or something like that. You could also look for a power player. It's always good to try to find somebody early on, either at the first base position or somewhere else that provides a lot of power. And then once I have some building blocks in place at those positions, it's like 3 or 4 key positions across my actual positional play, then I'm going to go back and fill out my entire starting pitching rotation, and I'm going to judge from there what's best available. Should I go back and fill out my other positions, or should I come back and start drafting some additional A potential starting pitchers that are going to go into my bullpen? And that's kind of how I would recommend prioritizing positions within the draft because of how the CPU is going to take players. I certainly don't believe that you should be looking for depth pieces if you have not filled out a starter at each of your positions. Your bullpen is a little bit different because, like I said, you could be drafting some of those veteran players to fill out your bullpen, or you could be drafting starting pitchers to switch to your bullpen positions. It's up to you how you want to do all of that, but it's worth noting that you can fill out your bullpen pretty easily with high dev players that are going to be really good for a long time. Hopefully this information was useful to you in some way. I know that not a lot of people are fans of fantasy drafts, but I love fantasy drafts, so I just wanted to share this info to those of you that might find this useful. If you did, leave a comment down below what your draft strategy would be. Have you done a fantasy draft? Are you interested in doing a fantasy draft in MLB? It's the first time I've actually done one, so I'm kind of curious to see if anybody else does these types of things in MLB The Show specifically. But leave a like down below, leave that comment, subscribe if you have not already, and as always, I'll see you in the next video, and I hope you have a good one.